Welcome, and in this lesson, we're going to learn how to log in and switch users in multi-user targets. Now, we're going to get to systemd later on as part of this certification section. However, if I type systemctl get default, what it's going to do is it's going to return what's called a target. This target represents really a grouping of unit configuration files or services that are to start whenever your system navigates or switches into the multi-user target. Now, the multi-user target is also called whenever we enter in a graphical target. And what the multi-user target does, it allows us to have multiple users on the system. It's not a single user target. Multiple users can log in. We can also switch into a different user. So how do we change users on a system? And I've demonstrated this several times throughout this section already. However, we do something called the su command. And it's a little bit more complex than what we've done so far. I've kind of negated a little bit of information, and so we're going to learn about that now. So the su command allows us to log in as another user. So if I type su root, I'm going to enter in my root password, and then I'm now logged in as the root user. However, what happened is it didn't load all of my profile customization information. So what is that? Well, first, what you need to understand is there's two different types of shells we're looking at here. We have an interactive shell, and it's an interactive shell if we're just typing at the command prompt. An interactive shell really requires input from somebody sitting at the terminal. A login shell specifies loading of our custom environment variables and a specific customization file. So, for example, if I go into my root directory and I type in ls-al, what we see here is we see some hidden directories. Now, again, the ls-al, what this does is it's a long listing, and it also represents all. I could just do an ls-a, and it will also show all. Well, what all does is it shows everything that starts with a dot and our regular files. If you notice, if I just type ls, there are no regular files that are being displayed. That's because we have these dot files. These dot files are considered configuration files on our system. I usually like to view those in the vertical output here, and so I do the ls-al, so I can also grab the permission information. So if you notice, we have bash history. Our bash history records all of the commands that have been recorded at the command prompt. In fact, I can type history to view those commands. I can even hit Control-R to search my history. And then we have the bash logout. Whenever we log out, everything inside of our bash logout is going to be executed. Then we have the bash profile. Now, this bash profile is a customization script for login shells. So what happens is everything inside of our bash profile, inside of each user's home directory, is going to be executed. Now, if you notice inside of my root home directory, because we're inside of the root user's home directory, which is, if I type pwd, it'll show my current working location, is /root, you'll notice that there's a custom one. Now, this applies to just the root user. We do have system-wide profile customization files. So what happens is this profile is executed when we enter into a login shell. So let's go ahead and edit this file. I'm just going to do a vim on my bash profile. Now I'm just going to echo some text. Echo hello, or echo you have entered into a login shell. Save and exit. So what happens is if you're a root user, if you're working in system environments, a lot of times you need to have custom environment variables. If you notice inside of this again, if we take a look at it, it's setting path environments. Everything inside of your path environment variable allows you to run it as an executable without looking for the absolute path of the location. So if we typed which ls, you'll notice that the entire location is usr bin ls. But I can type that without having to type in the full path to the program, which allows us to list the directory contents. That's because this usr bin is inside of my path environment variable. So if I echo my path environment variable, I see usr bin. So what can happen is we could customize this or anything such as an environment variable that's required to run a script on our system. So if the root user executes a script that performs backups and has customizations required when the user logs in, and the customizations inside of your bash profile are not run, what happens? Well, it's very possible your scripts could break. So when we're logging in and out of users in the system, we need to be coherent on, do we use a login shell? Now, when we first log into a system remotely for the first time, we are indeed inside of a login shell. But when we change a user, like into the root user, just by typing su, we're not in a login shell. And one reason I know that we're not in a login shell is because, again, the bash profile is executed. It's considered the login shell customization file. It's executed whenever we enter in to a login shell. Now, the bash RC customization file is executed whenever we enter into an interactive shell. And again, we're in an interactive shell, so everything inside of our bash RC file would have been executed. Everything inside of our bash profile, which represents a login shell, would not have been executed. So how do I log in and load all of the customizations as part of the bash profile? Again, I want to load all the environment variables, all the library paths, all of the scripts that need to be executed when I log in as the root user. I can do it in one of three ways. I can type su-. This represents login shell. su-l represents login shell, and su-login represents login shell. So if we were to enter this, we're specifying that we want a login shell. What happened here? You'll notice that our echo command that we entered inside of our bash profile was executed, whereas when we did it up here, it was not executed. Because we entered into a login shell. So we loaded everything associated with the root user. So just switching over to users, we can switch in and out of users without loading those the customizations for that specific user. If I wanted to log into the root user without loading those customizations, where I would keep really the same customizations as my regular user, I could just do an su. If I wanted to log in and load everything inside of the bash profile, the customizations in my login shell, I could do an su-. Now, the other part that happens is we have a global bash profile customization script. Now, there's a lot to read here. Maybe I want to do an ls and grep for profile to make the outputs a little bit easier for me to read. Okay, another usage for grep. Well, here's the profile. And if we look at the profile, all of these scripts are executed whenever a user, any user, because this is our global configuration file, whenever any user logs into the system. Whereas each user, if I log into the home user directory over here and take a look, has their own bash profile for their own customizations. And so that's why paying attention of if we need to log in as the login shell when we're logging into the root user is important, and understanding how to switch users in a multi-user environment is important. Now, again, one thing you need to understand is for the root user, a lot of times those customizations do take place. And if you need to execute a script and you're a new sysadmin and you log in as the root user without specifying the login shell, and you execute the script and it doesn't work properly, it could be because those customizations, which have been set in the bash profile, were not loaded. You don't have proper environment variables. Your library path environment variable doesn't specify a location where you have scripts to run, so you might have a command not found, and so that can cause issues. So in this lesson, we learned how to log into a system. We learned that whenever you first log into a system, you log into a login shell. But if you use the su command to switch users, that doesn't always necessarily mean you're in a login shell. We're always in an interactive shell if we're SSH'd into a terminal. And if we want to specify the login shell, we use -l or just a dash or --login. And we know that the bash RC customization file is loaded anytime we log into an interactive shell, and the bash profile customization file is loaded anytime we log into a login shell. So again, when we first log into a system, that's always a login shell, but not necessarily when we change user unless we specify it. We also learned that the Etsy profile is the global login configuration file. So for example, anytime you open up a new login shell for a user, everything inside the Etsy profile will be executed, but only if it's a login shell. So that concludes it for this lesson. Go ahead and complete this lesson and move on.